Hello everyone, this is ponderonweather. In this update, we're going to be talking about Tropical Storm Ian still making major impacts on Florida with a lot of heavy rain, and it's going to make a secondary landfall, plus a much colder shot of cooler air later on next week than what may be coming in the tropics after Ian. Welcome back everyone, how's it going? I appreciate everyone that tuned in for my live coverage, 8-hour coverage yesterday on Hurricane Ian to keep you as safe as possible. We got a lot to talk about in this update, so I appreciate all my followers and my new followers. If you are new to the channel, I like detailed weather breakdowns on North America and the tropics, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and notification bell to get all my daily updates to keep you ahead of the storm. So let's take a look at the big picture and break things down for you this morning into the overall satellite picture. And we can actually see we've got a newly developed, this is actually Tropical Storm Arlene out here in the Eastern Pacific. There is Ian still making a lot of impacts in Florida, and it looks to make a secondary landfall into portions of South Carolina. Plus, the tropics are somewhat clearing out, but we do have some instability out here towards the Leeward Islands. But for the rest of the country, we are looking up at this upper level low that's going to be traversing across and bringing some instability for them. And then we got a much colder shot coming in of next week. So let's highlight the details on Ian. Yeah, yesterday this thing was really rapidly deepening. It made landfall and then had some of those winds onshore of 140 miles an hour. It topped out into Cape Coral area. Back into Punta Gorda, it topped out about 124 miles an hour. Back into Grove City, about 110. Back into Sarasota Bay, 106. Into Venice, 104. Fort Myers area, 100 mile per hour. They did, in fact, have a 12-foot storm surge for them. So this is pretty high impact event, and just the massive expansive wind field that Ian brought. It unfortunately, it actually came ashore pretty much identical, same spot as Charlie back in 2004, but Ian was a much bigger storm. It was almost double the size, if not greater than that, and it jumped a very extreme heavy rain swath back into Inglewood, back into Northport. These are your rainfall totals over the last 48 hours, guys. I mean, that's a 20 inches. That is 20 inches. And that just lifted northeast overnight, still crawling at 8 miles an hour, dumping some very heavy rain over the Orlando area. They're checking in this morning around a foot of rain near Orlando. They're getting pounded this morning in Daytona Beach. But even further south and well away from the center over the last 2 or 3 days, you still picked up a good swath of 4 to 6, 7 inches back into Miami and the Fort Lauderdale. So this has been a very intense hurricane, to say the least, doing extensive damage and a lot of flooding, and it's still having major impacts on the state. In fact, waking up this morning in Florida, we're talking 2.6 million customers without power. That's nearly almost 25% of the entire state is still without power. So this has been a huge event, and unfortunately it's still having lasting impacts for many days to come. So here's the overall here's where we stand with Ian right now. Look at this. I mean, how often do you see this, of this orange shaded area? That is the tropical storm winds and how far they spread out from the center. This is goes to show you why we have 2.5 million people without power in Florida, because just the tremendous amount of wind field that Ian has been producing. Now it's actually going to be going over the open waters of the Atlantic, and then it's going to be recurving back into land. So all guidance suggests it's going to be making a secondary landfall somewhere in South Carolina, right around maybe a high-end tropical storm or a low-end hurricane going into tomorrow, and then making a beeline northbound deeper into South Carolina, dumping some very heavy rain into North Carolina, and eventually it'll transfer into a kind of a overall low pressure center. But we've got a lot of tremendous flooding well inland with Ian in the days to come. So here's the overall storm surge too, because once it gets back into the open waters, again, it's going to be able to regenerate itself. So we could be looking at some some storm surge of 4 to 6 feet along the shorelines of Georgia, back into South Carolina, and even some little bit lighter amounts as you head into further north into North Carolina. But that's still pretty high storm surge, with another potential hurricane making a secondary landfall going into tomorrow. So here's the estimated where all the rain, some of the heavier rain swath will be. We still are going to be dealing with all the heavier rains with the kind of the wraparound moisture back into portions of Orlando today, back into Daytona Beach, back into Jacksonville area. Still expecting some very heavy rainfall in those areas. Then the secondary landfall back into Charleston, going into Augusta, maybe the Savannah area. Those areas look to have the highest amounts of rain where it comes ashore, and it's going to be, again, another kind of slow moving system as it meanders its way through Raleigh, back into Roanoke, and all the way up into Huntington. Then eventually it'll swing off and get a little bit lighter amounts as it comes further north back into Philadelphia. But yeah, so overall we are expecting some impacts this morning right along the coastline, but really start to take a beeline downhill as we go into that's Friday morning. As we go into Saturday morning, I think it's going to be making the highest impacts from this event, and then kind of the leftover showers after it meanders into a low pressure center by the time we get into Sunday, with all the instability left over in portions of West Virginia and back into the Virginia area. So but here's the setup on the GFS. So, because, yeah, I mean, some of the latest model guidance does imply this drops it all the way down to a 980 millibar low pressure. That would, in fact, be a low-end hurricane. So, yeah, it could definitely, the more time it's able to spend out open waters, which is almost about 24 hours or so, yeah, it could definitely regenerate into another low-end hurricane. And the latest European models kind of thinking the same way, about 981 millibars right along the coastline of South Carolina back into North Carolina, dumping very heavy rain. You can see the tight isobars. So that's definitely indicative of some very intense winds going to be underneath that low pressure. And the Icon's probably the most bullish. It drops it all the way down to a 973 millibar low pressure. So yeah, it's definitely could be really regenerating back out of the open waters. And we saw how fast it deepened after it came off of Cuba. So yes, we could be looking at another hurricane making landfall as you go deeper into the day for tomorrow into early Saturday morning. But tornadoes are also going to be another prevalent concern as this tropical system does come ashore, making that second landfall. So along the coastline into South Carolina, into North Carolina, and parts of Virginia, they still have that tornado threat as this system comes ashore. So, but overall, here's the overall wind swath over the next 48 hours. So these are actually wind gusts, not sustained winds, but wind gust. Yeah, some of these could easily be packing hurricane force winds well offshore. But even as you go inland, again, those could be anywhere from 70, 75, even upwards to 80 miles an hour. It's probably not out of the question with this secondary landfall, especially into South Carolina, into North Carolina, and portions of Virginia. But you can see in the middle of the country where that upper level low is, we could be looking at some higher wind gusts as well in portions of Montana, back into Wyoming, as well as parts of the Dakotas, getting back into portions of Nebraska over the next several days. So here's the overall setup and where the precipitation is going to be over the next 48 hours. So again, we're that upper level low. We've got some instability in northern portions of Idaho, as well as Montana, back into Wyoming, feeding into the Four Corners, extreme Four Corners regions, and back into Colorado. But all the instability is going to be really centered around what's to come with Ian, especially along the coast, with very heavy rain the closer to the coastline you get, and lighter amounts as you creep in, on shore. So but by the time we get into Saturday, I think we're going to be having some of the leftover effects. It's going to be transitioning. We're going to have some drier air. That's depicted on the water vapor imagery with all that red intruding into that upper level low. So that's going to be the culprit to kind of eat away of all the moisture that's left with Ian, and eventually going to be able to move this out. By the time we get into the north, your Saturday, that'll shift it off with the dry air. That'll shift it off into portions of the Northeast. And you could be looking at some scattered storms with this instability as well. And there's that upper level low dumping some of those heavier rain swath into portions of northern Montana as well as the Dakota states. But as we go into Monday time frame, I think we can actually probably say goodbye to Ian, because all the remnants by then, and even what's left of the upper level low or the low pressure that's going to be transferring to, is going to be well out off to sea. And then the atmosphere is going to be resetting itself with this upper level low kind of winding itself down. By then, we could have a swath of energy into portions of Minnesota by then, back into the Dakotas and Nebraska. That'll swing down into portions of Colorado. But as we go into kind of the middle of next week, we got a pretty good shot of cold air. I do feel there's several troughs that should actually be coming down from Canada. And these are going to be fairly significant, especially the second one behind this one. So the cooler conditions you're experiencing right now for much of the east and getting into portions of the southeast, I actually think that continues. So once Ian moves out, we'll have a pretty good trough that's going to be diving in to portions of the upper Great Lakes and portions of the Midwest. That's going to bring a much cooler shot of cold air, while much of the west and northwest and much of Alaska too is going to be well above average temperatures. But by the time we go into next weekend, there's that secondary shot of colder air, and I think this is going to be the most significant shot of cold air that we've experienced so far this season. We're transitioning into fall by then. We're getting into that second week of October by then. So yeah, this is going to be a good shot of colder air, and you're going to definitely feel it in a big way, because the hint is, if you take a look at the teleconnections, and a lot of you snow lovers out there, you're going to be licking your chops that this was actually a little bit deeper into, winter, some of the winter months. Woo, this would be a bona fide snowstorm and a much colder shot of Arctic air. But it's the second week of October now. But yeah, by the time we get into that time frame, getting into October, especially around the 5th, the 7th, especially about the 9th time frame, it's got a massive drop in the EPO guidance. So that's indicative of the jet stream buckling in that part of the country, dragging down some of that coldest air of the season, and you're gonna feel it in a big way for a couple days. Yeah, because underneath that, if you take a look at the 850s, that's about 5,000 feet up in the atmosphere. It's got a cold shot, and all that's going to be able to filter down to the surface. But we've got a lot of purples showing up on the map. That's indicative of some pretty chilly air mass. That's going to be going by, this is the time frame. It'd be next Friday by then, but definitely a much colder shot of cold air. How cold we talking about? Well, right now, preliminary numbers going back into next Friday on the feels like it's going to be feeling a lot like fall, if not a first shot of winter. So you're going to be needing your jacket for sure. Those are 20s up here in the portions of southern Canada here. But yeah, widespread, 20s feels likes in Wisconsin, but Michigan, you already had some frost and freeze warnings already, but this is going to be another colder shot. It's probably going to be even colder than what you've seen so far. So definitely the much cooler, if not some colder conditions on the way for that part of the country. But underneath that, for the next 7 days, all the instability and the heavier rain swath is going to be associated with Ian for the next, I would say, 3 days from now. 3 days going into Friday, Saturday. Well, today, Friday, Saturday, and then it'll finally wind down as you get deeper into the weekend. But some of these numbers could be pretty significant coming into portions of 5 to 8 inch swath where it comes ashore into South Carolina, but then where it gets wrapped around and kind of stalls and changes direction, we could be looking at some even higher totals into portions of the extreme coastline of North Carolina back into Virginia, and some higher totals and creeping up into portions of Delaware. But there's the upper level low for the rest of the country and portions of Montana and portions of Wyoming as well as Colorado, with a couple inches of rain. But the rest of the country is just going to be experiencing really just kind of nice weather, nice fall weather. Back into really low dew points, a lot of dry air going to be inundating for a good chunk of the country, for the rest of the country. But what's coming after Ian. So right now, I showed you that little instability back into the Eastern Pacific. That is actually Tropical Storm Arlene. So that actually is going to be shifting and gravitating further north, and actually going to be transferring into a hurricane by the time we get into Friday. Could bump up even to about an 85-mile-per-hour hurricane, and then downgrading to a tropical storm. But it looks to be making impact, probably missing the Baja California, but definitely making impact as a tropical storm going into your early Monday timeframe in Mexico. And then what's coming after that into the Atlantic. So by the time we get into next weekend, they're already showing some hints. We do have a tropical depression out in the open waters now, but it doesn't look very, it could be meander into a little bit of a tropical storm. If it does, it'll take Julia. But besides that, by the time we go into next weekend, we are seeing some hints on the latest EPS guidance where we could have yet another possible system trying to form out in the open waters of the Atlantic, but closer to shore and closer into the Western Caribbean. This could be our next little storm that we have to definitely probably keep an eye on. This won't even come to fruition until probably sometime next weekend. So we got a lot of time frame in between, but this would be my most area of concern on our next potential storm that might be coming down the line, and it would be lining up essentially near Jamaica by the time we get into next weekend. And most of the guidance has this pushing westbound, heading towards the Yucatan and, eventually maybe possibly the Gulf again. So we'll just have to see. So I appreciate you guys watching. Do like this video. Definitely leave your comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Catch the latest update where I protect you before and after the storm.